Tony, your newest magnum opus has arrived, and why am I not surprised that after your two previous orchestral suites named 7 and 6, that this one is called 5?
Yeah, well, I was actually didn't want to do it really. I thought it's too obvious, and I don't really like doing the obvious. It would be quite fun to have slipped to 4 or something, but I happened to. There are 5 pieces on this, and it seemed I couldn't fight it. It's a bit like in the early days of Genesis, couldn't fight, and then there were 3. Just so some things, they're sort of a bit of a joke, and then of course they become the final thing. So 5. But this time I wanted to call it just 5. None of this 7 suite or 6 pieces.
Okay.
This is just 5, and it's just the digit 5 as well, really.
And so we're sort of on a countdown, and I'm asking myself what happens when we reach 0.
Well, I think I'll probably have passed away by then. I mean, it's easier if you're Adele and you're working upwards. Even if you are skipping out a few years, there's no end really, is there?
You could do a silent piece, like John Cage.
Well, I think 0. I'm quite looking forward to 0, but I don't think I'll get that far. I might, once I think 765 is sort of trilogy,
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure what quaternity. I don't know what 4-1 is called, but it doesn't sound as good. So I think probably I'll switch to something else if I do another one. Indeed.
Well, we've talked before. My musical coming of age was as much wrapped up in the mega rock bands of the 60s. Your own band Genesis and Yes and Pink Floyd and The Who. I was as much wrapped up in that music, weirdly, as I was in the discovery of classical music. But you, in a sense, had a similar experience because you had some classical background.
Yes, well, when I was a child, I used to get exposed quite a bit to classical music, which I always enjoyed. But I think when I got about 11 or 12, I got exposed to pop music, and I just completely fell in love with it. I had absolutely no discrimination at all. Everything in 1961 I liked. I can almost still quote the sort of top 10 I first listened to, which had Cliff Richard as number 1 of the young ones, and had included pieces like Let There Be Drums by Sandy Nelson and Multiplication by Bobby Darin, which is really kind of diverse and weird stuff. And I loved it all really, but by the end of the 60s I kind of got very much the other way, and there wasn't much I liked. I got much more picky, I think. I found that perhaps that through the 60s music sort of really evolved, particularly around with people like Beach Boys, Pet Sounds, I suppose, being probably the most important album, and then obviously the Beatles, later Beatles, and then groups which I really love, like you mentioned Procol Harum, and I don't know if you did or not, but anyhow, the groups in the late 60s that did well, Procol Harum, Family, the Airport Convention were a big influence, so that kind of took me there, and it wasn't really until I started, I think when I was at university in the late 60s, a friend I was sharing a room with, he played me Shostakovich's 10th Symphony, and I hadn't and I just forgot how exciting, how much I loved classical music. Was hearing that first movement, which is just such a stunning piece of music, one of my favourite pieces anyhow. And it just sort of brought me right back, and after that I was sort of right back in the two together. And within Genesis we were able to incorporate some elements of classical music. Steve Hackett was also very into classical music. We used to sort of swap ideas and pieces and things we come across a bit between each other, and that sort of had some effect on the Genesis music at the time, I think.
That music was, in a sense, symphonic. It was symphonic rock, if you like, and it was enormously ambitious and sophisticated, and you kind of wonder, why do you think it just vanished after a while? Because it's the sort of...
I don't think it really vanished. I mean, with Genesis, we kind of got to the stage when I felt very strongly, by the time we got to 1980, that we were sort of starting to repeat ourselves, and it'd be nice to try and do it a bit differently. I mean, the music business had changed. We managed to survive the sort of the punk changeover, but with having two very successful albums, which are still very much in the prog tradition, I suppose. I think and the prog has always been part of Genesis, always was right to the end, I think, but we had the other parts just got more prominent, we got better at it, got a very high profile, suddenly, it's quite exciting to sort of have hit records, and we never really thought we were going to have that. I certainly didn't. And, obviously with Phil's profile, that helped a lot, but, the first hit we had really was Follow You, Follow Me, which was pre-Phil's success and everything, and to be honest, wasn't much Phil in that writing on that. It was mainly Mike and I, so kind of it was something we sort of went through, I suppose, really. And I suppose, once we were down to three-piece, I'd kind of lost Peter and Steve, who were perhaps more on my side of the fence in terms of trying to do things, a little bit more off the wall. So, but I mean, I having said that, I loved what we did later, Genesis. So I have no problem with that at all. And I was always able to introduce a bit of that quality about it that I loved. But, to be able to come back with the classical stuff to something that is, much more akin to those early prog days is very satisfying.
I mean, you were the keyboard whiz of Genesis, and there's definitely a feeling of keyboard derivation in the sort of stuff you've written for orchestra now, these three suites. There's a spirit of improvisation in that keyboard derivation, a feeling of evolution, and that goes right through into the finished pieces. Is that...
Well, I do. I mean, a lot of the stuff I do write through improvisations, and sometimes I will just record, just me doodling about for a long time. And I listen back to a bit and think, well, that bit's quite nice. And then I think, well, a bit before it's quite good too. And you end up sort of, I have at various times just taken sort of like a chunk, it might be 20, 30 seconds, almost as improvised music, and just obviously tied it up a scrap. But use that as part of what I did. I did that quite a lot on Six, perhaps slightly more than I've done it on this one. I don't know, I do like to try and get the fresh things. One thing that working with the group really taught me was that if you could get a thing early, and you didn't try and fiddle about with it too much, sometimes that early essence was quite good enough on its own. You didn't fiddle with it. We used to fiddle with stuff an awful lot back in the early days. Later times we sometimes just did it, and it was great as it was. So I'm a believer in trying to pick up on that sort of spontaneous thing. I do try very hard when I'm playing to get my conscious brain out of it, and then that way you can sort of play things you don't know you're going to play. And with computers, which are sort of like incredibly sophisticated recording machines, not only can you record what you do, you can also see what you did. So if you can't quite remember the particular shapes and stuff, you can see it on the screen.
At the start of the journey, though, there is a thematic element. So you start with a theme and then you journey with that theme.
Yeah,
is that the way you tend to
sometimes just sort of mood pieces. I mean, the opening piece on this Prelude to a Million Years obviously starts off with a kind of extended kind of slow string passage, which was really just there's a
very English, actually. Very
I know, but it's English with that blues note in it. That second chord to me is crucial. One reason I wanted the whole album to start with that, because I thought, because much as I love Vaughan Williams, he would never use that chord, you see. So, and you say the rest of the intro has got touches of Vaughan Williams about it, but something like that second chord, and when I first played, I thought, oh, I love that. And he's like, oh, I only played sort of twice at the beginning, twice in the middle, and once at the end. But it's something about the effect that has on me that I really love. So I wouldn't call that's not thematic. That is just purely a sort of harmonic change that I hadn't heard before, and I just thought really sounded nice.
The phrase is contemporary English pastoral.
Well, it could be. I mean, I don't know what contemporary music is.
There's a twist on it.
A lot of contemporary music is, after all, is something completely different. Really. It's very atonal. I mean, antithesis of contemporary music in a way. Well, not all contemporary music, but so much contemporary music, because it is based around melody, as you say, melody and harmony. And I like melody and harmony that is kind of sort of slightly more unusual, I suppose. And so almost my favourite classical composers, tend to be sort of like, late 19th century through to about 1950s, 60s, I suppose. I mentioned Shostakovich, obviously, but those sort of people who use kind of like conventional harmony, but did some kind of weird things with it. And
exactly.
I love that.
Yes.
I really enjoy that.
Yes, so still writing tonally, but with
yes,
twists.
That's right. Once it gets sort of, just atonal and tuneless, I can't follow it at all. It's not for me.
Well, because you're a melodist as well.
I'm a melodist, but I like things in other people. I'm not a kind of heavy metal man, really, but I love listening to heavy metal. So you don't just like what you can do. I can't do so. I'm not very good at writing a 3-minute pop song, although I've been involved in quite a few, I suppose. But I don't feel that's my forte. Give me 12 minutes, and I can do something. I feel.
Would you say, on balance, that you prefer to journey than to arrive? Because that's a feeling I get from these pieces. That it's the journey that's interesting.
I love.
Although they all aspire to arrive somewhere cathartic, if you like, somewhere.
I love the creation of the music. I suppose that's what gives me the greatest pleasure. But no, I really enjoy arriving and sorting it out. I mean, you know, sometimes over the years, you know, you get to the end of something, you're not quite sure whether you've really finished it, and sometimes there's some back later on, and you think, oh, you know, I could have done that. And obviously, at this stage of this subject, and you just finished it, so I'm kind of pretty happy with the way they've all turned out. I was pretty happy with the conclusion on all of these, really.
Yeah.
And you know, but yes, I can't argue that sort of getting there, because all the hundreds of bits you don't end up using, and all the little deviations you take, and some of the sort of changes you had, that's really nice, but I can't use that, it's too much, you know, and all the rest of it, just to try and keep it, you know, so it doesn't become totally amorphous. I mean, people might say 15-minute piece is amorphous anyhow, but it kind of has a sort of structure. There are certain repeated passages, and
yes, certainly in the first piece.
Yeah, there's a logic about it. I mean, it's, you know, it's not verse, chorus, middle, eight, obviously, but it does have repeated passages. In fact, the first half and the second half is sort of almost a repeat of the first half, but with quite a few extensions, and obviously arrangement very different.
It's a 15-minute piece, the opening piece, and it was originally written for the Cheltenham Festival as an orchestral piece to be performed live. Yeah. No pressure at all.
I know.
Now, interesting, you work with this orchestrator, Nick Ingman, and talk us through the process of creating that opening piece for Cheltenham, because it was originally called Arpeggio.
Well, I called it Arpeggio. It was just a working title, Arpeggio it was called, and it went on the programme as Arpeggio, because I hadn't really sort of... I quite liked Arpeggio as a title, but everyone said, oh, no, you can't call it that, you know. Because I wanted that idea of the sort of, like arpeggios, because this sort of churning and forward movement. I'd done a couple of pieces on 6 where I'd wanted the arpeggios to be a bit stronger, you know, and carry on slightly more. And Paul Inchby, I worked with, is a fantastic writer himself. But, you know, he's kind of... What I was doing was slightly sort of rock idiom. He kind of didn't, you know, pulled me back from that sometimes slightly. And in the end, I slightly regretted that. So I wanted on this one, actually, by calling it Arpeggio, and I did the original arrangement we did with Paul, to say, I want to keep the arpeggios in, you know. It taught me that I wanted to approach this differently, so I thought this time I'm going to go into the studio and I'm going to do it slightly more artificially. I'm going to go in there, use my demos, I'm going to get my demos absolutely as far on as I can, get the arrangements as far on as I can, get all the tempos absolutely sorted, all the ralentandos, every little tempo thing, and use that as a template and play everything to it. That way at least I knew all the tempos are going to be correct, and because Nick is kind of comes from, you know, he sort of straddles the world of pop, classical and film, and he's very used to working, recording things separately. So that's what we did. We went in the studio, using my demos as a sort of background thing. We then did the solo instruments with the trumpet, saxophone, and then also did all the percussion and the harp. We did those all in London, so we did them all separately, so we could scrutinise all the parts.
So like a pop record,
yeah,
really.
In a way. Yeah. And they all worked, obviously, because they had to work with the arrangements we got down, which was a combination of what I'd done and a few things that Nick had done as well. And then we went to to Prague to record the orchestra, and we did it again in sections. We did the strings for a couple of days, then we did the woodwind and the flute and the choir. So, you know, it sounds artificial, but I think when you ask people to play music they've never heard before, it's very difficult for an orchestra to really get their heads around it, and that's what the problem I had before. If it's soft and it's easier, as soon as you get any kind of rhythm in it, I took a long time with the first one of these things, I did 7, of getting kind of the rhythmical idea I had on the final piece on that across to the orchestra. And by the time we got that, we had no time for anything else, and the resultant piece was not satisfactory in my opinion. So this time I wanted to get as much sorted out as possible, and you know, so that the arrangements I'd done kind of really suggested so much of what the final thing was going to sound like anyhow. Add what Nick added, which is particularly in the percussion area, but lots of other little bits and pieces. I mean, he does things in orchestra I wouldn't think about. And the result, you know, I'm so much happier with it, because the tempo is an extraordinarily important thing. I think when you hear a piece and it's, even if some bits are right, there's one little change that's not right. You know, at the beginning, for example, take the Project Millionaires, because that first part is completely timeless. Nick created a kind of sort of click he could play with and can get to the orchestra to play with. It had a little moment in the middle, which definitely is kind of slightly strange. And when we did it down in Cheltenham, because Paul had written it out in stricter time, it was not quite working. There was one little change that was just so wrong. And, you know, obviously we could have worked on that and got it more right, but it needed that approach just to play everything exactly as I played it. Because I really felt those changes happening exactly the moment they did, even though they're not in time, you know. And I wanted to get that across. So, and with the rest of it, the only thing we kept from my original demos was the piano all the way through,
Right.
and some of the Celeste parts. And that was used that as a starting point.
Well, there's obviously a great element of control here about wanting to have all the parts there so you can play with them in the mix.
Yeah, that's right.
Because otherwise you're reliant upon session time and rehearsal time.
And also the thing is you get a great woodwind part and the strings aren't so good, and of course there's so much spill with the microphones,
Exactly.
you can't do it, and you can edit
Exactly.
obviously, but you know, with this like I had total separation, you know.
Let's look at this melodic profile of your music a little bit more, because it's definitely there, and tunesmiths are a real dying breed, I think, these days. The melodies in your pieces feel like they're evolving melodically and harmonically. Obviously, you're working with lots of chords. In the playing of them, I always think they feel like they're evolving in the playing of them. I know you've mentioned this before, you're a big fan of one of my idols, Richard Rodgers, who, to my mind, is the greatest popular melodist of them all. His versatility was such that
he was
really very special. You mentioned, I mean, is that something you're, I mean, it seems so instinctive and spontaneous, the way melodies and harmonies evolve from your music. Is that something you're conscious of, or it's just something you just doodle away?
I think it's often...
How do you start? What's the starting
I think often
point?
it depends. Sometimes it's just a chord pattern or note pattern or something that kind of starts it off, and the melodic line sometimes comes afterwards. Not always. I mean, it was certainly true when I did the solo ones on the last thing with the violin part, the violin and the sax. On this one, a lot of it was there in the thing, and sometimes you just enhance a little bit what's going on anyhow with the piano part. Other times it's very intrinsic. I mean, there's one piece called Autumn Sonata where the actual melodic line was the reason for it. I mean, it's just two chords, you know, really. The first part of it, I'm afraid I embellished it. I couldn't stop myself going a bit subtler after a while, but it was just really two chords. So it's the actual line that is really crucial, and that's why it exists. So you have lots of melodies which are like that, others which evolve out the chords, some which are actually, you know, like with the sax parts on the piece Ebb and Flow, the faster sax parts. I mean, all that was kind of, I just had this backing which I really liked, you know, the piano doing a certain part, which ended up being the strings playing it. And I just doodled around lots of melodies on top of it, and I sort of created a kind of result from that. I like doing that. It's a bit like I used to work with Genesis when we were doing things like Cinema Show or Apocalypse and 9/8, where you kind of, you know, you had a basis, and then you'd write a kind of a melodic line on top. You knew you had something good as a starting point, and then you could do something on top of it, which was hopefully good in itself, but also enhanced what was there. You know?
Well, all music is development of ideas, isn't it? Really, I mean, I mean, that word is used in musical theory all the time. The development section, and that's exactly what it is and what it does. You also like using solo instruments in an obligato way. You did in your other pieces, and here you've got, for example, in Reveille, you've got John Barclay's cornet, And I really like this piece for its exultancy. I mean, it is a kind of musical wake-up call.
Well, Reveille is supposed to be sort of, I called it that because of the army sort of wake-up. Because the prelude is a prelude, it sort of sets the team overture, if you like, and then suddenly you get the Reveille. This is where we really start in a way. And, it's a very up piece, and I'm known for sort of writing quite a few fairly miserable pieces, but I think most of the tracks on this album, actually, I can't call them tracks these days, I have to call them movements, I suppose, don't I? Are fairly positive. Quite a lot of major keys and ending kind of on an upbeat note and stuff, So Reveille, yes, I mean, it's and I like the idea of using a trumpet as the line was. I was just fiddling around on what I had, and I happened to have a quite nice trumpet sample around, and I just tried it. I thought that really set the tone for this piece, in a way because you have to really try when you're playing with a sample to think like the player, not just play piano, all the time. And a few times I do that and you cheat a bit. But if you can really think what the player might do and what it might sound like when it's a trumpet or when it's a flute or whatever it is, then I think it works really well. And it was great. And John really rose to the occasion because although I say I write like a trumpet player, I do go quite a lot, or a cornet player, whatever, I often go quite a lot higher than they would choose to go. So you get these marvelous moments of the poor guy sort of you've got like this little trumpet and think about this big, to play at the end. Yeah. It was wonderful because, and okay, you can cheat a bit because it's done on its own. If you want to suddenly slip in, you can do that. Important to me that the result doesn't sound artificial, but how you get there. I mean, most film music is put together in this kind of way, And I'm sure, I don't know whether it's ever been. I mean, I do it because these pieces have never been performed live. Well, apart from the prelude, it's a way of doing it. And I know the classical, conventional method is the thing that's played to an audience first, and then you kind of fiddle around with it a bit maybe, and then you record it. But I come from such a different background. I come from that area where you create the piece on record. And is definitive in a way. Yeah.
You also think in a composerly way, though, because in Reveille there is a contrasting idea and a contrasting because you probably wouldn't want to sustain that kind of wake-up call.
I did repeat it one more time when I was going around the circles. I thought I was going away from it too quickly, but that's the loud bit.
Mind you mentioned Shostakovich 10. I mean, the scherzo movement, the second movement of Shostakovich 10, sustains that freneticism.
I know, well they do.
Angry.
I think it's quite difficult with the scherzos to really keep them going, But this because it was sort of like it's quite slightly militaristic feel. It's quite sort of whereas the preludes are quite rambling. You've got this because it's quite specific, and fairly simple harmonically, and it's quite driving. I sort of got a bit relentless, and I was sort of adding things every time round. I was sort of bass, and then Nick's idea was to add the choir, and we weren't there, so I had to go somewhere. So I had a second theme, which is sort of a related theme in a way. It's kind of melodically kind of connected, I thought. And by having quite a sort of definite key change between the two bits, to sort of make it kind of much more soothing and relaxing.
Conceive these pieces as a suite from the start, or were they separate pieces that you decided selectively to put them into a suite in the end?
I think those happened to be the 5 pieces I'd written at this point in time. Right. There was some, when I wrote the piece for Cheltenham, I had the second piece, which ended up in Ebb and Flow. Those kind of were almost competing as to be which was the main one. And there was a little bit of related theme work between the two. They kind of sort of got separated out completely. So those two are always together, I think. Once I'd written the 4 pieces, the main theme was that in order to make the suite work, I knew it wasn't because to call it 5, mind you. I knew I had to have the other piece, the 5th piece. And when Nick suggested using the choir, which I thought was a nice idea, but using it very much as a sort of block chord thing in the 2 of the pieces, I thought, wouldn't it be great to do one piece where the choir is much more prominent, much more dominant? And I'd come across this little bit I had never found a home for, which I'd written about 20 years ago as a possible sort of on a film demo tape or something. I'd done something, which was just a drone. It was a sort of with a few weird notes and then a little melody coming after it. And when I came across it, I thought, it sounds really good. I really must try and develop this. And I thought, it's perfect time. Got that big vocal crescendos in there. And let's do this. And so I wrote the rest of the piece from that starting point, drawing together a few ideas, but also...
This is Renaissance.
Renaissance, yeah. And, it's the most, so in a way, although it has the bit that starts as 20 years older, it's the most recent piece in a way. And in some ways, I'm closest to that for that reason, I suppose. And it's quite different from the others because it's much more... It's more moody. I'd say it's also more... And it ends with this very sort of triumphant, very solid, almost song-like piece. I'd say it's the closest of all the 5 pieces to progressive music, if you know what I mean, in the way it's approached it and some of the sounds and the thing, and particularly that final part. I just thought it had to be the final piece because that final part is just so sort of like going to the sunset for me, I just love the melody, and it was just...
That's what I meant by catharsis.
Yeah, well, it's a really cathartic piece, I think, that.
Resolution.
I mean, the only problem I'd say for me in this is the fact that, it's an album, it's a piece, well, each piece, but also the thing as a totality is best listened to all together.
Yeah.
Now, you're asking a lot of people nowadays, and I'm told their attention span is now perhaps 25 seconds, 25 seconds this, you haven't even got to sort of the first chord change, on this thing. And it's true of most of the pieces. So I'm a bit out of my time here, I think. But, I think if people, particularly people who used to like the old prog stuff, but also hopefully a lot of people who like, classical music in general. Because this does owe a certain amount to sort of the Vaughan Williamses and Elgars and Sibeliuses and stuff, I think, a bit. I mean, I can't help that. I am influenced by those people. And I don't think it's... I think it would be a enjoyable listen for those people as well. I can't really fight what I do. I have a certain way I work. I like extended pieces. I've never been... it's what I do best, put it like that. I like short pieces, but I'm not quite so good at it.
You've heard this before, very filmic, and you've written a couple of film scores. You wrote The Wicked Lady for Michael Winner and Skolimowski's thriller The Shout, which you did with Mike Rutherford.
That's right.
I cannot understand why there's not a queue of people waiting for you to write movie scores.
Well, I should try actually to do this for real, because
as a keyboard, you think of Hans Zimmer and people who work from keyboard programs. I'd have thought...
Well, I did try this quite hard. I think I'm not a very pushy person myself. I'm not very good at sort of doing what's required, I don't think. In the late 90s, when Genesis was kind of like looking like it was going to go, sort of not do much, both before and after the Calling All Stations album, I actually got myself an agent and auditioned a few times to do this with people.
Really?
I went there and things, and nothing came of it at all.
It's a pretty closed shop,
It's a closed
really?
shop.
Yeah.
Also, I just thought that people, I don't know really, I did have, I had one or two experiences with the films that weren't quite so good. I mean, I was originally down to do the music to the film 2010, and the director Peter Hyams, who liked what I'd done for The Shout so much he could sing the theme. I thought, he can sing that. It's not really singable, and he can sing it to me. That's fantastic. So I thought, this is easy. That's the sort of stuff I write in my sleep. And so I gave him some demos. I gave him a demo of a particular piece I thought would be great for it, and he said no. And we kind of, after being on it for a very fraught period of 2 or 3 months. I suppose I was sacked, to be honest. No other way of putting it. The producer on the film was very keen on what I'd done. He used to play the stuff. He said Nice Carlson loved it. But the director, he was one of those directors, Peter Hyams, who wanted to do it all himself, and he ended up actually using James Horner, and it was one of his earlier pieces, and sort of where he went in the end. And he's a very good sort of film writer, you know, and if that's and he just wanted to. I didn't realise he just wanted a conventional film score. I thought he wanted something a little stranger, and that was the problem I had with it. Really. But anyhow, so I haven't had great experiences. I've done a couple of other films as well, not both of which have sort of. I don't know whether it's, hopefully it wasn't because of the music, but neither really did very well. So yes, at one point I would have loved to have done a lot of films. I don't know about now. I've had the freedom to do these things, and you know, the idea of sort of having to bow to a director's wishes would be tough, unless they wanted to use one of these pieces and I could adapt it a little.
Do you have a favourite among these pieces?
Well, I think Renaissance at the moment, but that's today.
And that, of course, uses also unusually an instrument called the duduk, which is an Armenian instrument, closely related, I suppose, to the cor anglais. It's a sorrowful kind of.
So I think if you close your eyes and not thinking too much about it, it can sound a bit like a kazoo, but it's but it's no. It was the original idea of using that was Martin Robertson, who I've known since he was knee high, to a grasshopper, I suppose. I don't know. I love him. He's a sax player. He's a very good sax player and everything stuff. So I've used him obviously in my career a few times. He said, "You should use the duduk. I want you to use the duduk." So I said, "Okay, use the duduk." So when he came into the session, he brought his duduk, and I had this little melody that I'd originally just seen being sung with the choir going ooh, you know, and I thought, and so we thought the idea of him playing that. And in the end, we used a combination of him playing the duduk plus the choir, and it's actually because of a really nice ethereal quality, really, slightly unusual melody, and it's really nice. So it's a funny instrument because it looks quite basic, you know. It doesn't. It's not like you say an oboe, but I mean, that's got all sorts of knobs and stuff on it, metal on it and stuff. This doesn't have any of that really, but it's a lovely sound. Yeah.
Yeah, that piece does have a kind of atmospheric, mysterious feel to it, but you're heading again, as I keep saying, to something affirmative, to something positive.
Yeah, well, it starts off with this sort of quite moody, and almost slightly Middle Eastern sort of notes and stuff, I suppose, at the beginning, you know. So that's probably where the duduk sort of feel comes in, works quite well, and then it gets slowly more and more sort of structured, I suppose. But just I had I don't have enough silence in my pieces. I'm aware of that. But this actually does have a half second of complete silence in it, which I'm very proud of. And when it comes in as this big piano chord with the whole orchestra, it's just such a strong moment. I feel like, you know, and it's sort of worth it just for that one bit. The rest of it, forget it. But that sounds.
Do you listen to a lot of music as well as playing with music? Do you?
I don't listen to nearly enough, actually. Yeah. In fact, when I started doing this, I realised I was saying how much I liked certain pieces, and I was realising how, when I last heard them, was a very long time ago. So I actually had a session 2 or 3 weeks ago. I've listened to a lot of those pieces I used to love. You know, I still love them, and I hear them again. And it's amazing how they come back to me. I find myself sort of, you know, my brain won't stop sort of repeating them in my mind. Now, I get so saturated with my own music, I think. And I haven't just been doing this stuff. I've also, you know, had the re-release of all my old stuff and things, and also all the Genesis stuff over the years. Head gets very full, and I tend to, when I'm listening in the car and stuff, I tend to listen to Radio 4 most of the time. Right. You know.
What is your ideal day? I mean, do you make music every day?
No. Well, I have periods when I do. I haven't played I have played surprisingly little actually since doing all this. I think I need to flush it out of my system a bit really. I love just sitting down and playing, and I love sort of writing things. But as soon as you start to write them, you sort of the whole ball is rolling again, you know. And I mean, I just don't know whether I want to do that again or not. I don't know. I can't make up my mind about it really in a sense. You know, I've got a certain age, and I love writing music. I love recording it, and I don't know. The putting it out is always. It's the sort of that's the difficult bit, because then you've got other people's opinions. You know, I don't really want to know what they think. You know what I mean? But I mean, you have to accept that if you want to be. I've been very lucky over the years that so much music I've been involved with, obviously with Genesis, has had such, you know, had a great response from the audience, and that's fantastic, really. So, you know, I can never expect that again. So it's nice, you know. And when I did Seven, the first of these three pieces, it actually got quite good response, better than I'd had from any of my solo albums before that. So that kind of encouraged me a little bit, you know. And
I remember us talking about Blade, which has the solo violin part in it, and you were talking about the fun of being able to bend notes and use glissandi and stuff like that. And it occurred to me, and I've been thinking about this ever since, why don't you write an electric guitar concerto? Because nobody else has done so, or one, I know of one, and it was written by a contemporary composer who didn't really understand the instrument.
Well, I mean, obviously it's a good thought, because I think guitars is a very expressive instrument. I mean, it is the modern violin in many ways, isn't it? I mean, it has that sort of ability to pull the heartstrings and just play two notes, and you can just sort of do it, as opposed to two notes on a piano doesn't sound like anything to you. So a guitar can really move you. Yeah, well, it's obviously an idea, you know, and I don't know really. Probably because when I'm playing along and sort of I think, well, flute, you know, and I play the flute, and of course then suddenly the flute's taken over, and my guitar samples aren't quite so good. I mean, my guitar playing is even worse than my guitar samples. So I can strum along. I'm okay as a rhythm guitarist, but in my league I did have had the odd moment of trying lead guitarist. So I do understand it a bit, lead guitar, and I've played with enough people to know what sounds good. But I think to some extent, I suppose you probably would need the input from a guitarist at a reasonably early stage, I think.
Yeah. Absolutely. Do you have any idea of, do you want to continue writing in this way? Do you want to continue writing with an orchestrator and for orchestra? Or might you move away from it completely?
I've absolutely really no idea, I haven't thought about it. I said there are 3 or 4 options. One is yes, another one like this, another one is the drums. I love drums, so there's always that as a possibility. It's just as in the solo album world, it seems a bit pointless, because I said that didn't really work for me in the past. I think Genesis anything is pretty unlikely. And obviously the fourth option is to do nothing at all. And I think all those options are possibilities, really. I have a great admiration for Sibelius, who didn't write anything for the last 40 years of his life, you know. And he wrote the most fantastic, that Seventh Symphony is a wonderful piece of music, you know, it's a pretty good piece to end on. So I don't know, really. I mean, sometimes you think, well, I've done it, really. I mean, you can say to yourself, am I going to do better than that? I mean, Sibelius did pretty well with what he did. And maybe at a certain point you just think, I don't know that I can really do anything other than that, you know, I've done it, you know. So I do get that feeling sometimes, and I don't really know. I mean, obviously degrees of success can make a big difference. I suppose if suddenly this, you know, people went a bit further than some of the others, it might encourage me. But on the other hand, you know, as I said, I sit down at the piano and I get seduced by it. I go, oh, that's nice, that change, you know, and then you want to do that and you want to do that. And once you finish the piece, you think, well, what am I going to do with it? I can't just sit on it and sort of, you know, I've got to put it out somewhere. So, I don't know. Yeah, I would see myself doing something, but God knows what.